and we love you greatly. And as I said before, I say now again, please just bless this Sunday school hour that we're doing. And in your name we pray. What we are going over is the book of Genesis. So we started only 2 weeks ago on Genesis chapter 1, and we're only up to verse number 6. So there's not a whole lot that we missed, and we can always go over the first 2 days. So starting in Genesis chapter 1, verse 6, we read, "And God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters." Now this verse starts on day number 2. And on day number 2, God only makes one thing. He makes the firmament. Now, let's read the next 2 verses, and then we'll go over what it is and what the firmament is not. Now, one thing that hit me when I was reading this is that, okay, so on day number 1, we know God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, darkness upon the face of the deep. The Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. God said, let there be light. So there was... in the beginning, God created time and space, the heaven and the earth, which was matter, and then He made light. On all the other days, we find out, I think day number 3, God makes plants, and then on day number 4, God makes the sun, moon, stars, and then 5 is animals, 6 is people. When we read through all those days, God makes a whole lot of stuff on every day.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, tons and tons of things when you think the number of stars or animals or what have you.
Yeah.
On day number 2, He only made one thing. So for me, when I read that, I thought to myself, okay, that means that it was probably pretty important. God focused an entire day on one thing, and so I should probably notice it. Okay, so Genesis chapter 1, verse 7, we read, "And God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. And God called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning were the second day, the Rhonda."
This might sound stupid, but what is firmament?
Okay, and that is pretty much going to be the lesson for today.
Okay.
Yeah, believe me, we are going to cover that. That is the
Not
perfect
stupid.
question. What is the firmament? And so many times, every time I teach this, everyone's like, what on earth is, I've never heard the word until I read it in the Bible.
Like mold or something.
Yeah. Okay, so we're gonna go over something here, and the word for today is it was an E or an I. I'm a horrific speller, everyone knows that. Okay, so here's what you do. Write down the word exegesis. Exegesis is simply the manner in which you interpret the Bible. Now, you are going to be learning the Patrick Hayes methodology of Bible interpretation today. Depending on the church that you go to, they will, for instance, I'll give you the idea of, let's say Catholicism, okay, which I was raised up in. The Catholic Church, they teach you the Bible, but the way they teach you the Bible is it goes through several filters. Okay, so the filter is the current administration, right? So basically the Catholic Church as a whole and what it is currently teaching. And then you have past administrations, which is the popes, the cardinals, the bishops, everything in the past. So when you're learning, okay, so what does this mean in the Bible? What you would do is you would first consult with, well, what did they teach or explain? So depending on the church you go to, if they have certain beliefs, then they are going to want you to interpret the Bible based on the beliefs of the church first.
Right.
Which is one of the big reasons we're independent. As far as independent Baptist, independent I think is even more important than Baptist, because the idea is there's no overall structure that you are going to be learning the Bible through. We're just going to be learning the Bible, and I'll go over this. So exegesis is the method in which we interpret the Bible. And then another term you'll hear a lot is with independent is fundamental. Now, fundamental is simply supposed to mean that it is the Bible and only the Bible. As far as the first thing we're supposed to do when reading the Bible is just read it and believe what it says.
Right.
Okay, so before we do it, and I've had conversations with people and we talk about Bible stuff and they're like, well, that's your interpretation. I'm like, no, that's what it says.
Right.
Okay, an interpretation is when I read what it says and I try to figure out what it really means.
Right.
Interpretate, if you can think of it, and I'm going to get in trouble for this, okay, you have men and you have women, right? Men are fundamental. Women interpret. So a man says, I'm tired, I'm going to bed. All he means is,
I'm tired,
I'm going to bed. Okay? The woman interprets.
committed.
Yeah. Why don't you want to hang out with me anymore? Okay, so when we're talking about,
That's exactly right.
okay, when
Yeah.
we're talking about being fundamental, you know how in the Latin languages and Spanish they have masculine and feminine words and everything?
Yeah.
Okay, so fundamental we would consider a masculine word as far as all I mean is what I say and that's it,
Yeah.
nothing else. Now, obviously, depending on what we're talking about, when Jesus says, I'm going to teach you the parable of, well, that he just told us it's a parable. It didn't really happen. It's a story,
Yeah.
okay? But what we start with is just simply reading the Bible and then we go from there, okay? So as far as exegesis, we are independent, which means there is no filter it's coming down through, and that's why if you go to a different independent fundamental Baptist church, you will maybe hear something a little different, which is okay. We're allowed to have a different interpretation of things in the Bible, and that's, you know, the great thing. All I'm accountable to is God.
Yep.
You know, no one's accountable to me. Okay, so with this, I'm going to go over. So let's see. So we talked about Genesis chapter 1, verse 7 and verse 8. So now, the first thing we want to do is go over what is explicit. Explicit, we're not talking about vulgar language and songs. What's explicit is what it actually says that we can get from in the Bible. So when we read through Genesis chapter 1, verse 7 and 8, and we're talking about the firmament is relative to what? Well, right now, all we're thinking of is the firmament is a thing. So we're going to figure out what it means, but the firmament is relative to another thing in the Bible. And it's the thing that's mentioned most. God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. So the firmament, as far as its location is relative to
Two bodies of water.
to water. That's what we know for sure. So as far as defining what the firmament is, it's relative to water. And what it says, it is in the midst of the waters, which means that we know there is water on at least two of its sides. It's in the midst, like God made the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Where did he put it? In the midst of the garden. He didn't put it on the edge, right? He put it in the midst. So it was somewhere in the middle. Okay. Number two, what we know for a fact about the firmament, it divides the waters. And these are things that are explicit. It's telling us this. So really what we're doing, when we're talking about exegesis, the first thing we want to do is state the facts. What do we know for a fact that it is telling us? Okay, number three, there is water above and waters below. So not only is it have to do with the water specifically, it has some relationship to the water. Number two, it divides the waters. And number three, we know that there is water above it and below it. Now, and this is the reason, above it and below it is important because people sometimes say, oh, well, the firmament is the land. The land is in between the waters, it divides the water. And that's what a lot of people come to, except a couple of problems. Number one, there are waters above it and below it, and then I'm going to get to it in a little
There's
bit.
no water above the land.
Exactly.
Right, and I used to think it was the
And below it.
land.
Okay, so, yep, and we're, So, and then finally, number 4, what is the firmament called? Verse number 8. What do they call the firmament?
I call it heaven.
That's right. They called it heaven. Okay, so with those 4 things, what it comes down to is what is the firmament and how does it work? So before we answer that question, we have to define a term. So what's the term we have to define in here? Not firmament. We're going to figure out what a firmament is. We know what water is. What's the one thing we have to figure out?
Heaven.
Heaven. Okay, so what does heaven mean? Now, we know, and once again we're going to state the facts, we know for a fact that there is more than one because we've already talked about 2 of them. In Genesis 1:1, we see that God created the heaven and the earth. Then, verse 8, God calls the firmament heaven. So would we agree that those are 2 different heavens? Because in Genesis 1:1, if God created the heaven and the earth, and that heaven was the firmament, then he wouldn't need to invent the firmament on day number 2. Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is going over, as far as exegesis, we have what's explicit, then we have what is implicit, which means, based on the facts, we can deduce something, and this is Logic 101. The fact is, on day number 1, God created the heaven and the earth, so there is a heaven there. Day number 2, God created the firmament and called it heaven. Because God created heaven on day number 1 and God called the firmament heaven on day number 2, we can deduce that they are different as far as there are multiple heavens. Make sense? Okay. And that is what we can imply. It doesn't say heaven on day number 1 is different from firmament, which we call heaven on day number 2. That is what we can imply because of what it explicitly says. Okay. Now, it does explicitly tell us that there are more heavens. If you go to 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 2, the Bible tells us that there are 3 heavens, and it tells us this explicitly. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 12:2, I knew a man in Christ above 14 years ago, whether in the body I cannot tell, or whether out of the body I cannot tell, God knoweth. Such an one caught up to the 3rd heaven. So Paul tells us there that there are specifically 3 heavens, and when we go through the Bible, we find out what these 3 heavens are. So as far as defining our term heaven, we have 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so does anyone want to give me a guess as to what these heavens are, where they are, and what they contain? We have number 3, which is where God lives.
Okay.
So right now, Jesus is sitting on a throne. Do we agree that he died on the cross, he rose from the dead, he spent 40 days here, I want to say, and then maybe, forgive me the number of days, but I want to say it was 40. Then he ascended up into heaven where he sits on a throne, waiting until he's going to come back for the rapture. Okay, so here's my question. Okay, really, with a brief statement. That is where God lives. Jesus is sitting on a throne someplace. Here's my question. Can we get in a rocket ship, the Starship Enterprise, and fly to where Jesus is?
I do not believe so.
No, we can't. This heaven is outside of our universe. It is in a different dimension.
Right.
It is not someplace that we can travel to if we have enough time and enough, fuel for the Enterprise. I don't know what they use. Okay, so this is outside of our universe. This is a spiritual place. Although it is a physical locale, when we get there, there are going to be physical things there. This is not some place that we can get to on our own. Okay, it's not like heaven is a place we can get to and it's guarded and they have to keep us out until we're ready, allowed to go in. This is someplace totally different that we only get to after either the rapture or death. Okay, so then we have our second heaven. Okay, Genesis chapter 1 verse 14, we reread, and God said, let there be lights in the firmament of heaven to divide the day from the night. Let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. Let them be for lights in the firmament of heaven to give light upon the earth. And it was so. So we talk about two great lights that God makes in the firmament of heaven. So God set the sun, the moon, the stars in a heaven. So heaven number 2 is outer space.
Right.
This is where God put sun, moon, stars. Okay? Then that brings us to the first heaven, which we call the firmament. And the way it works, so here we have planet Earth. Inside of this larger circle is our atmosphere. The atmosphere is made up of 6 different layers, and there used to be a 7th, 7 being the number in the Bible for completion or perfection, which is what the original creation was. So you have the earth, you have the atmosphere, then outside of our atmosphere is where the moon, the sun, all the different stars, okay, the different planets are. So outside here in the outer space is the second heaven. The third heaven is in another another dimension somewhere, which we cannot get to. The first heaven is our atmosphere.
Okay.
So the mesosphere, ionosphere, troposphere, all the different layers of our atmosphere, total 6, that's what we learn in science. There used to be a 7th layer. In Genesis chapter 1 verse 20, the Bible tells us that birds fly where? In the open
Firmament
of
heaven.
Okay, so where do the birds fly? They fly in the sky.
Yeah.
Okay, so that is our first heaven. The first heaven is from ground level all the way up till you hit the point of outer space. And that is our atmosphere, and that is the first heaven. So heaven number 1 is our atmosphere. Heaven number 2 is out of space, where the sun, moon, stars, and all the planets and everything are. Heaven number 3 is where God lives, which is outside of our 3-dimensional universe, which we will go to one day. So that is how it works as far as the different heavens. Okay, so now it still does not define what the firmament is. It's telling us that there used to be water above our atmosphere. Now, the way that it works, here we have planet Earth, and we have water on the planet. Oceans, seas, streams, rivers, etc. Then we have the firmament, which divides the water from the water. It's in the open firmament of heaven, the first heaven, which means that there was water up above the sky, and there's water below the sky, right? The firmament is relative to water, and it divides the water, and it divides the waters from above and below the firmament.
Yeah.
Okay, very
Yes.
good question. So you think to yourself, that's strange that there'd be water above us. Number 1, how does it stay up there?
Yeah,
Okay,
right.
so let me ask you this. What are clouds made of?
Moisture.
99.99 water vapor, right?
Yeah.
They stay up there. Okay.
Yeah.
So it's just in the same way. It's kind of like when they build an aircraft carrier. You look at it and you're like, so the whole thing's steel. Yep.
Yeah.
So how does it float? Yeah. And it comes down to physical laws, which is water displacement. So it doesn't matter how heavy something is. It matters how it displaces water. That's how it floats or not. In the same way, okay, things can stay up above in the sky in several ways. So what I believe is that there was a layer of water around our atmosphere, and I personally believe that it was a layer of ice. Now, the lower atmosphere, we find water at sea level. Obviously, the oceans, the streams, okay, there's water all over planet Earth and in various bodies of water. Above our atmosphere, there was also a significant amount of water. This water is no longer there, and we will read later on how it came down to earth in the form of rain in Genesis chapter 7. So Genesis chapter 7, verses 11 and 12, we read about the first rain. Now, prior to this rain, It did not rain on planet Earth, ever. Up until Genesis chapter 7. And it talks about it, we'll read about it next Sunday in Genesis on day number 3, how the plants were watered from underneath. There was warm water that watered the roots of the plants from underneath, and we're going to read about that. So what happened was, during Genesis, this layer of ice, no idea how thick it was, but I can show you some of the physical properties and what it did. It broke up, and when it fell down through the atmosphere, that caused friction, just like a shooting star. It's a rock falling through the sky, causes friction, lights on fire. So the ice falling down was the first amount of rain that I believe happened on Earth. The physical effects of this water on humans, plants, and animals we will see when we get to Genesis chapter 5. Okay, for now, it will suffice to say that there was water above our atmosphere. I believe that this layer of ice stayed up there in one of two ways. Number one, it was a self-supporting structure, which means just like an arch. When we build an arch, all of the weight is coming in on itself, and because of that, it holds itself up. In the same way, if you you ever take an egg in your hand, and if you wrap the egg, your hand all the way around the egg, you can squeeze as hard as you can't break it. Why not? There's an equal amount of force surrounding the egg. Same way, you could take that same egg, I believe, I've never done this, but if you took a sphere and dropped it down into the ocean and had it sink all the way down to the greatest depths, it would never collapse on itself.
Really?
Why not? Because there's an equal amount of pressure on it. Okay, so number two, the second way that I believe that ice stayed up there was magnetism. Now, if you take ice, or I should actually go one step backwards. If you take water and you cool it down, cool it down, cool it down until it gets to below 32 degrees Fahrenheit, it will turn into ice. How many knew that without any help?
I do.
Okay. So if you continue to cool that ice down to negative 300 degrees, what you end up with is the Meissner effect. The Meissner effect is what happens when you take two magnets and you can actually cause the two magnets to have different poles facing each other, and one magnet on top floats above the magnet below because they're repelling each other. This is actually how they have monorail trains run in Japan.
Yeah, really?
They have them on
Yeah,
electromagnets,
amazing.
so the train, it's the best suspension system in the world.
They like float.
Really? Yep, the trains float on an electromagnetic field,
Wow.
so it keeps the train off of the ground.
How
So
weird is
really
it?
smooth.
It is.
Okay, so anyway, yeah, I mean, and that, we can show you that as far as physics class, but what I believe happened was this ice was cold enough where it had a magnetic property, and the magnetic field on planet Earth caused it to hold itself
they were
up.
repelling each other.
Yep. Now, at the same time, it would have been just as easy for, if this was a solid piece of ice all the way around the planet, the force of the weight of it would have only kept itself up by making itself stronger, just like an arch. Make sense? Because it's trying to come in on itself from every single direction.
Yeah. So it's
Okay.
all supporting.
Exactly. It was a 360 degree, three-dimensional arch
Wow.
all the way around. Anyway, that gives you an idea. And when you read through Genesis chapter 5, you find out that there were people that lived to be 1,000 years old. You find out that people grew to be giants in size.
Yeah.
So my question for you is, okay, how did people live to be 1,000 years old, and how did people grow to be giants in size? Not to mention other giant animals which we're finding fossils of today, which we call dinosaurs. And a lot of people don't understand that reptiles and some fish and different amphibians, they will grow throughout the course of their life. That's why we find giant snakes. because if the snake lives long enough, it'll grow and it'll grow and it'll never stop growing. Now it does slow down, but the point is, if you had a reptile that never stopped growing throughout the course of its life, and it lived to be 1,000 years old like people did, how big would that reptile get? And that's all dinosaurs are. Dinosaurs are giant reptiles. They're
Yeah.
very big,
Yeah.
but they're still just reptiles. There's nothing fancy
Well,
about
I
it.
remember talking about giants in Sunday school
Uh-huh.
one time, and how there was actual proof they found bones and
Oh,
stuff
yeah.
of them. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
and we'll get into that, as we go. So anyway, that is day number 2, and as far as how we define heaven, we define firmament, and does everyone understand as far as exegesis? When you're reading the Bible, the best way to understand something is read through it, write down the facts, figure out what is explicit, and then based on the facts say, okay, it says this and it says this and it says this, so that means that this is the case. And I'll give you the quick, LaRonda, here's your quick quiz, okay?
Okay.
When Jesus was baptized, it says he was in the Jordan River, and it says, and Jesus came up out of the water. That's what's explicit.
Right.
So that implies that he was down in the water.
Yeah.
Okay, because he came up out of the water, that
He was
means
down in the water.
Yeah, he had to be down in it in order to come up out of it. So that is taking what's explicit, taking what's implicit, and that is why we have a doctrine where we baptize by immersion. Because if Jesus was down in the water, well, then we just do what he did. We get down in the water. So that is exegesis, explicit, implicit, and it's easier to understand the Bible when we go through that. So, okay, so opening it up for questions about what we went over.